Okay, let's do it. Welcome back to what probably is going to be a crazy week. So know that I'm not going to ask you how you're all doing right now, but if you would like to reach out and let me know, I understand. This is an interesting week in that it's a little bit different than the things we've seen before, right? Up until now, we've really been looking at different things and how they connect. And now what we'll be looking at is how all of the things connect. So know that this week there's definitely a lot of information in what we're looking at. So I thought we'd start by just looking through the second exam a little bit. Your grades are online. Overall, it went pretty well. I'm trying to think what really stood out. Well, I guess that'll come through as we go. Again, I think what you guys did really the best was play with some of those digital tools. So I think that that'll help a little bit with the final project, and we'll do some more of that today and through the rest of the course. And then we have a variety of things we're going to talk about. So we're kind of going to ease from climate change. We'll talk about some solutions today. And then we will also begin to look at what we call elemental or earth systems. So kind of taking different elements from our periodic table and then seeing what they do and how they transform in our world. And it is, I brought all of the colored chalk, let's put it that way. There's lots of detail to add to some of this stuff, but there's also some good resources online that I'll share with you as well. So let me just start following the chat and turn down the volume. Sounds good. Okay, yeah, so all your grades are online. I'm trying to think what really stood out in these. For the most part, everybody did a pretty good job with the non-renewable fuels. Something that maybe wasn't highlighted on the website, but we had discussed was the idea of offshore wind as well. So I found it a little surprising that some of our coastal states maybe weren't candidates for wind, but I also get that the website might not have provided that information. And so we'll talk a little bit more how you source information from different places. And good morning, Anna. And I'm going to guess Nisha's online as well. And yes, question 1 was pretty good. Question 2 was pretty good too. At times there might have just been some confusion about, I guess, the phase of the biomass. Some people were talking about how corn itself might be used as a fuel, while you really have to transform it into something else, right? That's more of a fuel for ourselves. And yeah. With the ozone layer, really the biggest confusion here was the names perhaps of these different layers. So who here can remember the name of the layer that we live in? What's the lowest layer closest to the ground? Troposphere. Yeah, that's the troposphere. And then I think there was just some confusion with labeling the layer above that, layer A here. It does contain the ozone layer, and very confusingly it's called a layer, but it's not really its own layer in our atmosphere, right? What's the name of this second layer up where ozone is good? Anyone? Up in the stratosphere, right? That's going to be that second region. And again, especially with these online exams this semester, you're more than welcome to go back to your notes or source the information online too. Pretty much everyone got that the Montreal Protocol was right looking at ozone depleting substances. Many of you mentioned chlorofluorocarbons, which was great. And so, yeah, we'll continue to look at the Paris Climate Accords and how that is different in relation to climate change. Everyone did pretty well with the question on air pollution in India. One thing you may have noticed, right, is that a lot of these things that lead to the pollution, right, burning of things like wood or agricultural residues, diesel generators, things like that. Most of these are promoting things like particulate matter pollution, like soot and dust, or carbon monoxide. And so I think the biggest challenge was just identifying some of those primary pollutants. So those are going to be those 6 that we talked about. And overall, though, people got where it was coming from, and for the most part, some of the health impacts. But no, right, one of the goals for your final project is to identify specifics of these different things. And so I think several of you are probably identifying specific pollutants as well. So you can think back to that list of 6 that the EPA has been talking about. For the acid rain, as we sort of looked at urban environments, there were really 2 camps that people were in. One was that we were going to have more energy and more people producing more waste, right? So more potential for acid rain. And the other one specifically related to episodic acidification here, meaning that over periods of time it can kind of build up quickly. Might have related to things like all of the asphalt or streets, right? So all of that water is going to run off and collect and pool and become very acidic compared to if you had lots of green space, for example. And Yeah. And for the last one, right, this was actually very different than some of the questions we've seen before in that it was open, right? This was really like a share your perspective and sort of defend it. And right, I mean, I wrote this prompt. I can tell you I don't believe that this is true myself. I mean, it may be the view of certain people, right? But the premise here was that there's many more factors than we're seeing in a simple cartoon. And so some of the better responses I saw included discussions about things like how maybe population rates might take a while to change, right? It's not quick and easy to change the number of people on this planet, and yet it's much easier to change, say, where resources are going. So it might be better, even if in the short term, to maybe use some of this food for people rather than fuel. And then another good point people were bringing up was that a lot of this pollution is going to be affecting the global south, right, even though it's not coming from their resources or even their actions. And so we'll continue to see that, right? Even today, as we look at some of the solutions or things we can use to tackle climate change, we'll find that, well, they're definitely all connected, right? So you kind of have to pull apart the pieces little by little. Any other comments or thoughts? I only got 4 dot pages documents, so I consider that a win, because I have a difficulty opening those even though I have a Mac. Okay, so the good news is that you really only have one of these left, right? And it'll be in place of our final, which is to say that it's graded the same as the previous 2. And as you probably realize, right, it's going to cover really the last half of what we've done in class, but it'll, of course, we'll touch on these things too, right? Because they're all, as I've been saying, connect. And I don't know, have they given the final exam date yet for us? I don't think so. I think they've done just the common finals. But no, right, after we go remote after Thanksgiving, I'll be broadcasting, of course, mostly online, well, exclusively online for everyone. And so it'll be pretty much like the exams you take in class, you'll just have a little bit more time. I think we have 2 hours for the final. Okay. And so I just wanted to look briefly at the syllabus again. I've just been updating it to reflect what we've actually been doing, right? So that when you double check, it matches. So believe it or not, we're actually on our last page already, or nearly the last page without the final and stuff. And we are right here, Monday, November 2nd. So today we're going to be talking about environmental systems, Earth systems. We'll do a little bit more with Earth data, try to find some better data perhaps to describe. And I'll put that assignment up later today. And from there, really what you see is we're going into these more specialized topics, right? So we'll talk about waste next week, which will actually be the focus of part of the Sustainable Food Week on campus. Then we'll talk about things like toxicology and sustainability. So know that these aren't necessarily things that are going to be in like a textbook, for example. These are going to be their own fields that are still developing. And so really what we'll do is we'll do like the greatest hits out of each of these. We'll hopefully try to inspire you a little bit to become interested in one of these areas that is more complex and applied than just the water cycle. But it's still very relevant, right? Toxicology is what all of us are worrying about all day these days. And so we'll share some resources that you can sort of explore those. Okay, so I do want to talk just a little bit about our waste management unit. So as you can see, we kind of split it into 2 parts. We'll talk about waste itself, right, what you do with it when it's there. But of course, we'll talk about reducing, reusing, and recycling waste as well. So the good news is that those 3 verbs kind of give you all the tools you need, right? 3 different actions you can take. And we'll talk about applying this in our sort of everyday lives. And the way we'll do this is we'll sort of think about garbage also from an e-waste perspective too, not just literal computers and things, right, but all of the garbage that's on the internet. So I don't know about you, I spend a fair bit of my time on the internet these days, and there's a lot of garbage on there, right? And so we'll talk a little bit about sifting through misinformation and specifically related to science. And we'll talk about how you actually share information online that's valuable as well, how you can not just recycle, but sort of maybe reduce the content of garbage on there. And so as part of the Sustainable Food Week on campus, we're running, or CURES, which is the environmental working group, is running a competition. So the good news is that you guys will be doing this as part of your homework as we explore your final presentations, how to make a small video, how to share it online and such. And so the way this will work is all you have to do is either take a photo or video of some sort of food waste in your world. So this could be an empty Starbucks cup outside, that's more waste related to food, or you could look at all of the food that's thrown away in the cafeteria or on the street in New York. So my guess is the first step in this is going to be the easiest part, right? It's so easy to find garbage especially in our lives, especially in New York City. The second part is what I'm going to help you through, right? We're going to figure out what goes into even a very short video, right? And it doesn't need to be you smiling into the camera. This could just be your voiceover. But you're going to be describing the waste that you found, and you're going to be talking about what you can do with it. Right? Are you going to compost it? Is it maybe better used for feeding the birds? Is it maybe something you can think about reducing, right? Maybe making less food or not buying things in plastic, all that kind of stuff. And there will be prizes. So one of the prizes for this class will be that you won't have to do a homework. And there will be two categories. One will be the most number of views. So it is a bit of a social media contest in that sense. But we're also going to have a panel of judges, of professors, who are going to help judge the one that they think might be the most creative solution or the most effective solution. And so know that even your homework can go to good cause in that way. And so next week, as also part of some of the pop-up events for the incoming students for next year, I'll be talking about this. And this will coincide with the details for your final project, right? How many slides, how many words, all of that stuff. As I talk about, right, the kinds of content you're going to have in this homework, we'll also talk about it with the final project as well. So just to kind of clarify, and we'll talk about this later today, this week we're still focusing on analyzing data, right? So sort of that middle part. We've looked at collecting. You've submitted your links, or you will today. We'll look today more about analyzing and sort of figuring out what's in the data. And that's really what this challenge is about, right? Looking at waste and figuring out what to do with it. But that last part, right, the presentation is what we're focusing on in the coming weeks, which includes things like how many words in your final project and what is a good video, right? What's not just some other garbage online. And so, yeah, so you'll hear more about this next class and next week as well. But feel free to also get people involved. They can win some prizes as well. We have composting kits that you can either take home or bring back in the spring. And some other, I don't want to say cash prizes, it's not literally cash, but there are incentives as well that way. And so know that this is not going to be done this week. We'll worry about this next week, but we're getting prepped for that. Is anybody else doing anything with the Sustainable Food Week on campus? I know they're doing a clean out in the rooftop garden, and I think there are some other events too. I'll have to share them with you guys on Thursday. Okay, are you ready for the real material? So today, all we're going to do to start is go back to where we were. So I spent a little bit of the weekend kind of just playing around, trying to make sure that your assignment is not only realistic, but manageable, right? There's so much data on NASA Earth data. And so I thought I'd start with something that worked for me and then kind of guide you towards one of the ways you'll collect your data for this homework. And again, you're definitely invited and really incentivized to use some of this data for your project, right? You could imagine, you'll see in a second, zooming in on a corner of the world, wherever your environment is, choosing a parameter, right, like pollution or mangrove deforestation, whatever it is, and then coming out, in this case, with a GIF of that. And so to just give you a sense of where we're headed, right, this is going to be some of the data we'll look at. This is actually ozone data. So you'll notice perhaps that the blue in the center is the least concentrated, and the red at the top is the most concentrated. So, right, ozone mostly exists in our poles, right, to help protect from the sun. And this is just changing over a couple years. It's kind of hard to tell exactly what's going on. But something we could do, for example, let's say your project was looking at Brazil. Let's say you were looking at pollutants, right? You could take a bit of a snapshot. Here is from 2015 to 2020 and some of the changing ozone over time. And so this could be one of your sources that you use, right? This would probably be better suited for something like a for something like a slide deck, right, or a presentation. But you could include individual images from your GIF into your written paper too. And so really, your goal this week for homework is to come up with one of these. It does not need to be the most beautiful thing in the world. It doesn't even necessarily need to show you as much information as we would like. It's going to be more about just processing the data. So I thought we would go through and do that. So the good news is that you're really already pretty familiar with all of the different options and tools here, probably with the exception of how to make the GIF in this case. Right? We know, for example, that we could toggle different layers, and if you wanted, you could actually include several layers at once. It's probably too much for me to do. Where is it? coastlines. Well, I guess you could include night and day data if you really wanted. That does look pretty cool. Right, so probably the first step is going to be identifying which layer you're interested in. And in a moment, you'll see again that we have quite a lot of options. So the challenge is just going to be identifying not only what's here, but what's available, right? What's maybe more than 1 year of data or whatever you'd like. The second step is going to be kind of finding your local environment or region. So let's say that we'll just do North America for right now. Could even be larger than your specific environment for your project. And then the last step is becoming a little bit of a filmmaker, right? So I am by no means any expert in this realm, right? But two things you're going to do is you can select when you start your projection, when you end your projection here on the bottom, and then right before you film anything, you'll just get a sense of what it looks like. So for example, we can run this. This might actually go very slow. This is going to be every day over the course of 3 years. So you may even notice, right, if I hover my mouse over the GIF button, it says that that's way too much data, right? Too many frames are selected. So the nice thing is that this is actually going to limit you. So maybe instead of day, maybe I'll do month. Maybe I'll shorten the period a little bit. Oh, all of a sudden it came up. So now I can actually take a movie, or a GIF, however you want to call it. And so now if I play this, right, I'll see what it looks like, and then we'll consider whether or not it's worth keeping. And so what are we seeing here, right? Well, things like seasonal changes in ozone, right? These colors kind of become bluer over time. It looks like I turned that on by mistake too. And so really, all you're going to need to do then is select a region for your image or your GIF. And then you'll notice here, you just need to process it. So one thing you actually can do, which is neat, is you can increase the resolution, but you'll notice that it's telling me it's too large here. I think it has a maximum file size. So here in this case, usually some of the lower resolutions are better. You'll create your GIF, and then you'll wait. And I was embarrassed to know that if you open them up in like a PDF viewer, it actually shows you each image. I'd never seen that before. So after it creates it, we'll see how you could put it into a written paper, or you can just upload it onto Google Slides, for example. And we'll do more of that in the coming weeks, right? But we want to just get it first. This and a short description of the GIF itself is what you will submit for the homework. And so always takes a second. And there we go. Right? So we can kind of look at some of the changing bands. In this case, actually, the two different ways that the lines cross represent night and day. So there's a lot of information in here. But after you download it, and I'm realizing that the people online might not be able to see this because it's not in my browser, but right, you have the individual images. So you might be able to choose something like an image from 2015 and then maybe an image from 2016 or even later to compare. And so again, the challenge here isn't necessarily, well, I guess part of the challenge is getting the data, right? Pulling it from the website. But really the goal of this assignment is going to be to just kind of analyze what's going on in these images. And so that's going to require some of the knowledge that you have, right? Of the environment, of the seasons, of the pollutants and things like that. But let's do, so that was kind of a quick breakdown of how to go through this, and I'll type out the directions for everyone as well later. Oh, good. Michael sees it too. What was I going to say? Yeah, so I thought we would just maybe choose another one. Know that, just like you kind of saw me last week, it's not always perfect, right? You don't always get to a great set of data your first time. But as I've sort of played a little more, I thought we'd troubleshoot together. And then, oh wait, no, Michael doesn't see it. 1 second, let me just do this quickly. I'm just going to add the preview file so that you can see the individual images. That'll be more important later too, but okay, 1 second. is NASA Worldview. There we go. So for everyone who had missed what I saw online, so after you download the GIF, it gives you the individual images kind of like in slides. And so, for example, you could imagine taking, say, an image from 2017 and putting it next to an image from, whatever, 2015 to compare for your final project, for example. And that's kind of what you'll do a little bit, right? Because the GIF doesn't really stop, and so it's going to be helpful to kind of look through each of the images. So, for example, we'll start in January of 2015. We'll try to find January of 2017. Where is that? And then we'll try to compare. So I'm going to try to delete everything between those. Okay, so these are two images of, wait, actually you guys tell me what we see. What do we see here? Is this a map of Mars? What is it? Where is the map of?
Kind of hard to see the glare.
Oh, sorry. Does someone want to try to put the blinds down in the back? Are there even blinds there? Oh, jeez. Okay, well, I'll help you out a bit. Maybe someone online. Thank you, Isabel. Yes, we have an image of North America, right? We have a close-up of really the Northeast region. And we can see, right, maybe what's not clear in the image itself, but clear from the layers that we put in. We have two different measurements, right? We have ozone at night and ozone during the day. So one thing you might want to do if you were going to describe this is, right, figure out, okay, so the day, if you can look up here, is going from left to right, and the night is going from right to left, if that helps, if there's a change in those things. And then, right, just even comparing these two, we can see some changes, right? It looks like the red, which is representative of a very high concentration, was deeper in 2017, right, compared to this kind of orange in 2015. So presumably, over 2 years, right, get to the same day, and it looks like the concentrations have increased, right? Does that mean that it's always increasing? Well, that's the pattern we kind of expect, right, with the fixing of the ozone hole. I don't know if these two data points alone, right, prove it necessarily, but it does match our trends. So this might match with another article you have, for example. And then, right, you also might be intrigued to see the other interesting stuff that's there, right? Like, for example, missing data. That's going to be relevant, right? That's important to note, too. And maybe things that don't change at all, right? That could be a good thing. I realize I deleted a bunch of the data here, but that's going to be part of it. So know that part of your assignment will be getting these images, and then part of it will be just kind of exploring what's there. And I want to emphasize that there's no secret or hidden information, right? This is really just using the skills that you have of identifying and classifying to see what's there. There's sort of no magic to it. Just take some time. Okay, so I thought we would do one more together, hopefully. This one actually looked nice. Maybe I'll just show you guys this one. And then we'll move forward. And so in this case, we're looking at the land surface temperature. We're going to be looking from right around 2005 to 2020. You'll notice again that this is too wide a range. There's too much data here to make an image right now. So maybe we'll do that at the end. But right, not only are you looking at the whole world in terms of pixels and stuff, you're also looking at every file. And every month is kind of slow. And so I thought we'd watch. So again, because we're cycling years, it's not like it's going to be a linear pattern. And you'll notice some data is missing, right? Those, when it goes completely dark, or some of those black scratch marks. But we'll notice, right, the trends that we expect in some ways. My guess is you probably won't use surface temperature for your analysis, though you can. And yeah, and this will run, right? It's got about 10 more years of data. So now let's just try to cut it down to get it to what we're interested in. So yeah, maybe let's look at Africa. We've seen some interesting changes with carbon monoxide there. Maybe we'll look at surface temperature as well. So something that will cut down your file size is going to be to zoom in part. Looks really detailed, actually. And let's maybe just go through a smaller window. Maybe we'll try every month from 2010 to 2015. Looks like that's still too large. I'm not sure if changing the frame rate changes the file size. So let's just choose a smaller window. There we go. Looks like we can capture roughly 3 years. Oh, sorry, Nisha, thank you. There we go. Okay, we hadn't really started yet. So in this case, first let's see if it looks good, and then we can figure out if we want to take this image as well. So it looks like during the winters it gets cooler. That makes sense. Looks like the Sahara, though, kind of keeps a lot of that heat, and then it looks like our data cuts off for a bit. So maybe not our best window. Maybe I'll try to increase this to not 1949. Let's try 2015 to 2017. One thing that's going to be helpful too is if you look at the data in the top left, it'll often have the years of when the data is good for. And if you click, here we go, the information, it'll show you the range as well. If it's all black, right, you're going to want to change your dates or maybe even change your data set. So this doesn't look too bad. And so again, what we can do is after we've seen something maybe worth analyzing, we've identified our dates, and this is now white instead of gray. We can click again. And you'll notice that you have an option, right, to select how much we're going to look at. It's really a lot of flexibility, I think. You'll notice that this still says create, so it's a big enough file for us. Let's see if we can make it a higher resolution. We cannot. And so you'll click create. You'll let it sit. The thing I will say, right, is when we think about all these satellites that we send up into space and all the man hours and people hours that go into creating this data, there's still so much missing, right? Look at all of the dark on this screen, and also look at, right, all that missing data too. And so that's really why we need environmental scientists and people who work with them, in part because we've got so much to do, right? We only really have data for 20, 30 years for most of this stuff. It's kind of hard to get good data for your homework in that case. Patience is important with these websites, and this is actually such a great site that if you refresh it, it doesn't lose everything you've done in case something bad happens. But when you make lots of mistakes, you're going to want to maybe just type the website in again to refresh. I had to refresh many times this weekend. So I'd say that this is maybe a perfect thing to look at for the homework, right? You have a defined region. You have a set of data that's relevant, right? It's showing a fair bit of information. The only thing, right, if you're a perfectionist that you might play with are things like maybe the scale. For example, it looks like Africa is kind of within a certain region, right, relatively warm. So maybe there's a better scale here that would represent what we want to see. Not sure if that's the case, but we can check. So in this case, redder is hotter and whiter is not. Let's see if this looks any better. Still in that same period, just sort of shuffling some of the options. Kind of like your filters for social media. And the other part too, right? Even in places like the information, they're going to have good background too, right? So maybe you find a good data set, but you're not an expert on it. There's going to be resources. They actually link you to the actual data, which is kind of nice. I'm waiting for my computer to just explode. So that's a rough semester. I shouldn't say that because I know they're listening too. Okay. Again, this is going to be your preference in some ways. Whatever helps make it easier to kind of analyze what's going on. And right, even though you end up taking the gift to send to me, you're still more than welcome to kind of toggle through the time as well. Right? You can take screenshots. I think there's a photo button up here on the right. And so you can kind of more easily identify, right, without size limits and things like that, what's going on. And so, for example, right, let's say there isn't data for a couple month period, right, you might choose a different season of the year to look at some of that data too. Okay, so I'll spell this out a little bit later in the homework, but really what you're going to do is you're going to go to Worldview, you're going to select a layer that's most relevant to you, you're going to add probably, one to start and play around, and then you're going to use the skills that you've been developing of, playing with the layers, maybe toggling them on and off. Right, again, there's even base layers. You might just even look at cloud patterns and things if you're interested. And so that'll be that. And then again, the goal here is to be analyzing data. So if you're having a lot of trouble, right, maybe more than a half hour's worth of searching, and you can't find anything, you just email me and I'll either help you out or provide you something to go through too. Any questions before we move away from climate change for a second, or measuring climate change impacts? Okay. So as we move forward, right, I wanted to provide you guys, well, definitely some data, but some ideas about how we can address climate change. And so, right, there are going to be a wide variety of people with all their kind of crazy ideas out there, and so sifting through them is going to be the challenge. But really more important is going to be identifying which ones are relevant to you, right? Turning your farm into a solar park probably isn't relevant if you live in New York City. But maybe, say, buying an electric vehicle or, right, going vegan might be a solution that sort of fits with who you are and what's realistic. And so here was a paper that I found as we sort of look at analyzing sources this week too, that was looking at some of the impacts of tackling, impacts of solutions to tackle climate change, but also looking at how they're included in things like textbooks and how we can see if they're most effective. So I will say that this article is up on Moodle, and if you're looking at a climate change issue for your final project, you can definitely read through. You can use this as a source for sure, and look at some of the information. I will also point out that as we begin to describe this image here, which we'll do in a second, right, some of the solutions on the bottom here, right, like buying green energy or washing or recycling, might be relevant to your project even if it's not a climate change project, right? So this is going to be a great resource to maybe compare different solutions that we have. But I am really not interested in the individual solutions right now. I want to know what this data is telling us. So we're looking at a graph. I can start you off with that, right? It looks like that there are categories of impacts, right? Very high impact things that we can do and very low impact things. But I want to know what you see, right? The information is there. What can you pull out from what we're looking at? And so my favorite place to start is by just describing what's there, right? Don't think about connecting things yet. So, maybe a somewhat easy question is, what is lower impact? Living car free or buying green energy? Yeah, right? And so the way that this graph works, right, is that the lower bars here are going to be less of an impact. How do they measure the impact here? Is it going to be trees grown? Is it going to be lives saved? And again, right, going through the paper on your own to start might be more of a help. Any ideas? Yeah, right here on the y-axis we have emission savings. So clearly the higher things save you more, the lower things save you less, right? And that's really what you're going to do with your GIF, right? Is just see what's in it and then type it out. And so let's look. What other information is on here? Who can tell me something about the countries that are included on this? One question would be, what kinds of countries are included on this? Are these more developed or more developing countries? Yeah. And so when you look at the paper as a whole, my guess is that that's where most of the educational programs they're looking at are, right, that they can measure. And my guess is that, these countries are fortunate enough that they get to worry about solutions, right? Many more developing countries don't really have a choice when it comes to which fuel they're using. So I'm trying to think of a good one. One sec. Okay, what's the most impactful thing that you can do based on this? Absolutely. And so that can relate to things like population that we've been talking about in ecology. Anybody, and this is beyond looking at the data, anybody have a sense as to why having one fewer child would have such a big impact? Yeah, right. All those other things don't need to be done if there is one fewer person. Anybody have an idea why the USA is listed above Russia and Japan as being more impactful? So what this line means is that if you have one fewer child in the US, it's 120 on average, less, tera CO2 tons per year versus Japan, which is all the way down at 20. Yeah, different people in different countries have emission profiles, right? Americans might drive longer or consume more energy to heat their homes. And so, right, something we'll find is that, again, your solutions and choices depend on the environments that you're in. And so, for example, right, living car-free in the United States, we'll see that the USA ranks really high up there, is going to be, right, almost more impactful than, or as impactful as just getting an electric car in Australia, right? So at least in Australia, you get to keep your car, but if it's electric, whereas in the States, it's so bad, we kind of need to get rid of them. Let's start to be a bit more realistic here. What's something on here that you've done or that you'd be willing to do? Like in the next year, for example. Sorry, which one? Hey, that's convenient, but yes, no, I agree. Avoiding one transatlantic flight. Though I will say I've had international students in this course before, right, who don't really have that option, right? They need to see their family and friends. What else? Yeah. And as we talked about with food, right, it's not even about completely switching right away, just moving towards that, right? And there are implications of going maybe just pescatarian or vegetarian or even vegan. And again, it's never about the extremes of these things. It's about finding the comfortable place for you. I don't know if anybody wants to talk about this. Is there anything on here that you would never do or never want to do? Please. Live car-free, right? And for many, it's just not an option, especially right now, maybe during coronavirus, if you're commuting or whatever that is. But, there are also people who cars are really their life, right? Maybe less so in the city, but there are them too. My mother is one. She always talks about how they're going to have to pry her gasoline-guzzling vehicle out of her hands. And that's because she was just like a motorhead in high school or whatever. And so, right, again, maybe we don't expect everyone to give up their car, but I'm sure there's other things on here that you might be more comfortable with. What else is something we wouldn't want to do? Oh, yeah, hang drying clothes. Also, again, we see that these are on the lower end as well, right? So you're probably less incentivized to do these if we realize that it's not really worth it, right? Or it might not be worth the time savings to you. And so I'll say that that's what this unit, or that we're moving to, elemental cycles, is really all about. It's all about accounting, right? And every day you do this all the time, right? Do I have enough time to get a coffee? Do I have enough money to take the bus and then this, right? All of us are becoming experts in figuring out what's best and most relevant for us. And trust me, I wish that there was an app that could figure out everything for me, but, right, that's kind of the fun in some ways. And so really, again, it's not going to be that, I'm never going to tell you not to have a child, right, or whatever that is. That's, as we've discussed, not how life works, definitely as a professor, but also just as a human. But my guess is, right, that if you maybe then instead lived relatively car-free or used, Uber pools, and then also bought green energy, that it couldn't have maybe a similar impact. Though I will say there is something else we can see here about the number of emission savings that shows that having one fewer child is on a completely different scale than everything else. Can anybody see how the graph is constructed to show that having one fewer child is almost 10 times more impactful than all the others. So in this case, we're looking at the y-axis again. And you'll notice, right, it starts out by going 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there's a big jump, right? It jumps to 20, and then goes all the way up to 120. So it's still accurate data, right? They tried to just squeeze it all on, right? If they tried to graph it with just 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 up, it would probably be larger than the page. And so, right, even within this, it's really not as simple as living car-free and avoiding flights to then match having one fewer kid, for example. And so, one of the challenges, right, when we make decisions in our world, should I get the coffee before class? Should I go to that party? Is it safe enough? Whatever all the crazy things we're budgeting now, right, is we need to make sure that we're understanding the information that's there. And so I'll admit, right, there are people who did this study, and they had probably some bias in what they did, and as much as we can respect and trust this data, it probably changes too. And so the difficult part is, right, that just as maybe you're running to get your coffee before class, somebody steps in front of you in line, you have to rebudget, right? Do I have time? Is it worth it? And we'll see that just a little more and more. So this is a little less relevant for this, but right, they were looking at high school textbooks to see which of the different things or solutions were mentioned. And right, you can see popular things like, for example, conserving energy. But what does that even mean, right? That could mean so many things. I don't know if you all got that email from the college earlier today about how they phrased that we're going home after Thanksgiving to reduce heating costs, which was interesting. I always thought it was related to coronavirus, who knows? But you can bet, right, that is going under their conserve energy budget too, right? And listen, I'm sure it will help the college. That's not my question. But right, it's also just funny how we word these things as well. What's another one on here that maybe you've heard of or you've done before, or you do, different than what we've already said? Gina?
This isn't exactly intentional, but I don't have a car on campus, so reducing the price of driving.
Yeah, and again, outside of a coronavirus year, Manhattan is a wonderful place to not have a car, short of not being a commuter, right? But you got the subway, you got the buses, and, it's kind of a chance to explore, too. That's what college is. And so, right, some of these we may find ourselves doing without even knowing it, right? Like turning off the lights before you leave the room, even if it's maybe less impactful. And then there's others, right, that might not even have a direct climate impact, right? It's not like when you vote, for example, that CO2 is removed from the air, right? But there are these longer term things that you're kind of buying into. And so again, as we kind of notice the differences in these impacts, people can become, what's the word? Virtue signalers, right? Where they talk about doing things instead of maybe doing them. And so one of the worries I have as an environmental scientist is, right, hearing about like straws every day for years, right, about how that's going to save the world. And yes, removing plastic straws from our ocean will save our turtles and make things better. But I think we all know that there are definitely better solutions than just that, right? Creating an alternative, whatever that may be, changing our food system so that we can still have bodegas but not get a plastic bag and tissues and straws and forks and whatever it may be. And again, I know we're in crazy times where you're probably not going to be bringing cutlery everywhere, right? But we can still also plan for whatever is most realistic now and also realistic in the future. But again, I'm guessing there's also things on this list too that you're like, I would never ever. I don't know, maybe you just don't like planting trees, or maybe it's just not practical, but I'm sure that there are dads in the suburbs, right, who would never not mow their lawn, for example. And that's fine, right? What you need to do then is get dad to do other things, like maybe, I don't know, try a veggie burger, conserve energy in whatever way that may be. And so the challenge that I'm giving to you, right, is as we see this wonderful list of things that you could go out and do today, is just to balance, right? Know that, endlessly buying organic food isn't really the only thing we're going to need to do, right? You're going to need to tackle some of these green bars up top, even though it probably is going to be more challenging. But don't worry, I'm sure that there's many people out there who, right, may not want a kid right now or might think about sharing cars or things like that. And as technology changes, it changes pretty quick too.
When it says like have one fewer child, are they talking like one fewer than like the country's like, average?
That's a good question. So my guess is because they looked at many different countries, it's based on the average number, which I think in the States is like 1.9 or something. But really, I think that this was written in a polite way to say that take the number you have in your head and just dial back a little bit. Which, I mean, having friends that are having kids right now, it seems like it's one or the other, right? They have a kid and they want many more, or they have a kid and they don't want any again. So, I think that especially as a parent, and not being one I can't really speak, right? You want to make sure they enter into a good world where they have the resources they need. And they're not saying here don't have children, right? It's just that you want to kind of make sure that they're not going to have to do all of these things all the time, right? And so we'll see. We'll see. But I like how this kind of connects back to population. And so Bruna's entered into the chat that her project is, again, a little bit about plastic waste. And yeah, I know that a couple of people are looking at things as well, like compostable cutlery and things like that. And actually, in my research lab, we've been working on to create biodegradable packages and things for soaps and whatnot. And yeah, I think she makes a good point in that it's really about your comfort zone, right? But know that there are things on this list that can be even fun. I know that sounds like a boring professor thing to say, right? But, just as I was talking lectures ago about gardening being a social idea, right? We could also imagine that there are ways to incentivize people to do this or do these things. And so I guess it must be on here somewhere. We'll minimize waste and buy less packaging. That definitely touches on Bruna's comments. But also it touches on things like the food waste that we'll talk about next week, right? And so again, first step is just being aware. And then the second step is beginning to maybe take some actions. And yeah, there was one on here that I would never do. I want to find it before we're done. There was one saying that you shouldn't have a dog ever. That dogs are, right, they require resources, they don't necessarily add back in some ways, but I think you'd be hard-pressed to find animal lovers, right, giving up their pets in that way. And so, right, even if you're not willing to move on that front, oh, that's really cute, the dog's ecological paw print. You then have to think about, right, how you can make things better, right? Are you ordering all of your pet food from Chewy every day online, right? Some online company. Are you maybe instead going to your local food system and finding it? I don't know how that's possible with dogs, but I imagine that it could be. Okay. So we are now going to shift from a little bit of this discussion on climate change to a discussion on Earth systems, which I'll go into in just a minute, but we've actually really already touched on, right? We've talked a little bit about the nitrogen cycle and the water cycle, and so where we're moving is this kind of idea of the Earth as a system itself. And so just like in our bodies, right, we take in different nutrients like proteins and carbs, and they do different things. We'll find that in the environment, different elements do different things as well, right? Carbon serves a purpose with life. Sulfur serves a purpose with cooling the atmosphere. And so I think what I want to do is watch a video to help us bridge the two topics. So we're going to watch a video on geoengineering, which is a kind of crazy concept about, not just acting about not using a plastic straw, but really changing the structure of the Earth. And as we'll see, as you can kind of see from the title, it's not something that we really want to have to do, but we'll see how it touches on a lot of the things that we've looked at. Internet friends, let me know if you can hear it or not. I did put on the captions if that helps. So I'll turn up my volume.
By the end of the 21st century, humanity is becoming desperate. Decades of heat waves and droughts have led to
Really? Nothing?
unusually poor harvests, while the warming oceans yield fewer fish each year. In the tropical zones, millions suffer from famines and resort wars. Millions more flee to the north.
I can't do that. I think we will put it online and you guys can watch it on your own time. That would just be way better. But let me just sort of filter through some of the images here so we can talk just a little bit. Only because it related so well to the last exam we did and what we're doing today. Where is it? So not what I wanted. Here we go. So really what this whole thing is about is Earth scale projects that we could do to help fix all of our problems. So the example that they're giving here called stratospheric aerosol injection, anybody want to give a sense as to what's going on? What layer of the atmosphere are they putting it in? Are they putting it at ground level? That's the troposphere, right? We're thinking stratosphere. And so in this case, they're going to be injecting aerosols, kind of like when you seed clouds, but the premise is going to be to cool the atmosphere. So can anybody think of an aerosol or an element that helps cool the atmosphere? There's kind of already one in the atmosphere. It's a layer in the stratosphere that we've talked about, the ozone layer, right? That absorbs the sun, so in some ways it helps cool. But this is a different element. This one's found in coal. It's a pollutant that leads to acid rain. And when it comes out of volcanoes, it cools the earth quite a lot, actually, usually. Yeah. So what they're doing here is, as you will watch later, I can't believe we can't play a video online. Right, we already know that the earth warms up due to greenhouse gases, for example. But what they're projecting is that if you sprayed things like sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, you would actually be able to cool our environment. And we know that that works, but the problem, right, is that if you spray sulfur dioxide, which is a pollutant, even if it's protective up there like the ozone, it's probably going to come back down as well, right? For example, in the form of things like sulfuric acid. And so again, is this well-meaning? Yes. Could it work? Yes, but there's no way that we know all of the different impacts that it could have. And so, for example, right, they're only going to add enough sulfuric acid to reflect, I think, roughly 1% of the Earth's sun. But the issue is, right, even though it might cool down, like you can see here, and this was actually after a volcano, it was releasing sulfur dioxide. The worry is that all of those other harms that we don't know about, or that they even predict, could be the case. And so, for example, it might only cost $8 billion a year to spray this sulfur dioxide, but the effects of climate change are undoubtedly much worse, right? People moving, lack of food, strife left and right. And so, ideally, it looks like a great economic decision, but we probably know that those rarely come with good environmental decisions as well. And so, right, we're worried not only could it change things like our agriculture, if it's beginning to rain acid rain. Where is the other description? This is one of the other possibilities of what could come, something known as termination shock, which is where it will then actually get warmer. And I have to admit, as a scientist, that doesn't surprise me, right? So this is kind of the profile of the change in temperature currently, as we expect. And even if we began to cool down with these aerosols injected into the atmosphere, what we might find is that if we were to ever stop, that then it could kind of ricochet in the wrong direction. And so, for example, it could just get much worse. Okay, well, I'm going to have to put this one online, but I actually really like this series. They do a good one on climate change, too. That one may already be in the Moodle. And so with our last 20 minutes, I'd just like to go through one of these examples of these environmental systems. So I thought we'd start with the carbon cycle, not only because we're pretty familiar with that, but because that's probably the most relevant, right, also from a climate change perspective. So give me a second to transition to the board, and then we will do that. And I realize that that's not correct. Okay. It's not even my cord. So the good news is that we're only going to do things we've done before in this class at this point. Everything should be relatively familiar. We're just kind of going to piece it together in a different way. So we're going to look at elemental cycles. And in this case, we're going to do three things. We're going to list all of the different things in our system. We are going to map them out. And then we are going to judge them. Figure out what works and what doesn't. And this is perhaps a different way to explain the collect, analyze, and visualize. But this is more of maybe a data analysis in some ways. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just make a list. And I want to list all of our pools and all of our flows. So, right, we've typically thought of this in relation to water, right? A glacier might be a pool of water in that it stores it, whereas eating fresh food, right, is going to be a flow. It's sort of transforming or changing. So who can think of a pool or flow of carbon? There's probably one in each unit we've done. So let's think. What about the one under the ground that we use to power all our cars right now? Right? It's kind of a collection of carbon that we then burn or oxidize. What might we call that? Yeah, fuels or fossil fuels. So in this case, we're going to have something like fossilized carbon. Let's think of some others. Where else do we find carbon in our environment? Where do the plants get their carbon from? Where do the plants give their carbon after they die?
Soil.
Yeah, soil carbon is going to be a good one. I know we've left Halloween season, right? But it's all about graves and decomposition and all that fun stuff. What about all the living forms of carbon? What might we call that? We talked about it from an energy standpoint.
Like biological carbon?
Yeah, we'll call it biomass. So technically, you are biomass, but you still have control over your biomass, right? Generally, when we talk about biomass, it could be either a living tree, you, a plant, but also things like, maybe dead wood or things like that. So you'll notice too, right, all of these three are generally going to be on land, right? Either underground or on top in some case. What about the other parts of Earth and the carbon there? Is there any carbon in our oceans? Is there anything living in our oceans? Yeah, right? So we're not only going to have carbon in the surface of the ocean, but we'll also have carbon in the deep ocean. Anybody know why we separate these two out? Has anybody here ever been to the deep ocean? That's kind of the point, right? We mostly live in the surface part, and then there's other stuff that goes on deep down, right? We know stuff lives there, but it's not really like there's a lot of transfer. If that makes sense. Okay, we are missing two. One is where plants get their carbon from. So what kind of carbon do plants take in? We breathe it out, and they breathe it in.
Carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide, and where do you find that usually?
Atmosphere, air.
Yeah, absolutely. Atmosphere. And so, right, we missed the extreme, which was all the way up. What about carbon that is in some rock all the way down below? What might we call that? There's a bunch of words. We'll use sediment just for today. If I can fit it. So just to make it a little more clear, these pools on our diagram are going to become our dots, and the flows are going to become our arrows. So right, we're going to just play a game of connect the dots in a minute, and the good news is that you're becoming more aware of which of these are connected and how, and I'll fill in the gaps. But now I want to think about how carbon changes. Can anybody think of any sort of interaction where carbon goes from maybe one of these places to another? So for example, what's it called when carbon goes from the atmosphere to biomass? So what's it called when a plant takes carbon in and makes more plant? Your 6th grade bio vocab word. Takes the light in.
Photosynthesis.
Yeah, puts things together. Photosynthesis is going to be one of the main drivers of this cycle. Right? That's going to be about taking carbon from the atmosphere and putting it down into biomass or the ground. And that's going to be, again, a big driver. There are a couple others. Anybody have another idea? Even human-based. Where do humans release carbon or carbon dioxide mostly?
Like breathing, right?
So that's a good one, yeah. Respiration is going to be a big part of it. So I guess just to be clear, right, this is going to be going from CO2 to sugar. And then here, right, you're going to be taking things like sugar and making CO2, right? So you eat your food at lunch, you breathe all out that carbon dioxide throughout the day. And so these are going to be somewhat balanced, right? Hopefully, but we'll see. And, okay. What about the stuff that breaks everything down? What do we usually blame for, say, rotting corpses? Is it the corpse's fault? No, right? They're just there. What's doing all that work? What's taking that carbon and transferring it to other places?
Decomposition.
Yeah, decomposition. In this case, right, usually not animals doing that, usually not even plants. What other tinier, gooier things? Yeah, things like fungi or microbes, for example. So we'll consider this microbial decomposition. And you're realizing probably, right, that we're putting together the pieces to make stuff and break stuff and put it back where it belongs, right? We're trying to cover all of the pieces of what allow life to occur on Earth. So we have photosynthesis, microbial decomposition, we have respiration. We're missing 3. One of them is still going to be similar to respiration, but our cars do it, right? They also take in oxygen, but what are they putting out? Some sort of stuff, right? We could think of many ways to describe this next one. It could be industry. In this case, we'll just say human emissions. But to be clear here, right, we're talking less about the CO2 we breathe out, and we're talking more about the energy that we create when we burn fuels and some other stuff as well. So we have 2 more. One of them is going to focus on the oceans, and one of them is going to focus on our sediment here. Anybody know what it's called when stuff becomes sediment? So, right, it's floating around our world, and then eventually settles into like a pool, and then sits. The name sort of gives it away a little bit, I guess.
Sedimentation.
Yeah, sedimentation. And we'll find that while all of these things up top are kind of juggling the carbon, right, keeping it in flow, sedimentation is going to be a way to kind of pull it out of the cycle. It's kind of like the drain. And so in this case, it's going to kind of all funnel over time back into the rocks, right? And then things like the plants drag it back up. And humans, right? We dig out our fossils. Okay, so we only have one more. It has to do with our oceans. And I guess we didn't talk too much about this yet. But I'll just call this the air-sea exchange. And simply put, that just means carbon is going to come and go, right? So that could either be things like fishing out animals to eat, could also involve carbon dioxide coming into our oceans from all of our emissions. Okay, so we have our list, and now we need to put them together. And so as long as there's still time. Yeah, we have about 10 minutes, that's perfect. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take our dots and we're going to lay them out. Now, arguably, if you're just looking for the information, you could lay them out anyway. Does anybody have an idea maybe where sediment or atmosphere should go? We're drawing out a map. Doesn't really matter where it goes, right? But in this case, I'll put the sediment at the bottom. And I'll put the atmosphere at the top. What we're about to do is come up with one of those systems that we were looking at, right, with all of the arrows connecting these points. And while technically the information is still valid if your atmosphere was on the bottom, right, we're trying to sort of build a picture of what we're looking at. So you may remember back in the water cycle one, right, we were like drawing different simple examples of like mountains and oceans and things. Well, we could add that onto this when we're done too. Okay, what's next? Anybody have an idea? We've done sediment. Maybe we'll split it up a little bit, right? Maybe we'll do oceans over here. Maybe we'll do surface ocean. And maybe we'll do deep ocean. And really what you see that we're coming out with are these kind of layers, right? So you can bet that the deep ocean really doesn't interact with the atmosphere, right? Because there's a whole layer in between. And similarly, right, once stuff becomes sediment, it's going to be hard for it to get back out into the atmosphere, right, for plants to do their thing. So let's see, we have the oceans now. We have soil and fossilized carbon, right? Maybe we'll put the soil on top. We'll put the fossils down below. And where's the last one go? Where should we put biomass? Underneath the sediment? I would hope not.
In between them.
Yeah, probably somewhere around here, right? I guess just for fun, we'll put it up with all the rest of the living stuff. Okay, so now that we have all of our dots on our map, right, now what we can do is identify some of the flows. So I usually like to number these, because it's going to get a little busy in just a second. So who can tell me what number goes where? So what you're going to want to find are two dots, and you're going to want to suggest a number that goes between them. So I'll start you off. We can take photosynthesis. We can go from the atmosphere to biomass, right, taking carbon in. And that will be that one there. I won't write it all out because we already have it. Can anybody suggest another one? What about number 5? Where does number 5 go to? Where does sedimentation end up?
Sediment.
In the sediment, right? So you know the arrow will go there. Where do you think it's coming from mostly? Right? Well, let's think. If you've got soil and earth, right, it's not really easy for things to move down, right? But if you throw a dead fish into the ocean and it happens to sink, you might get something like sedimentation. So in this case, we can add our 5th arrow there. Right? And so primarily the carbon's going to be going in the direction of the arrow. Okay, we did 5. We did 1. Okay, what about number 2, right? We talked about how number 2 is living things breathing out carbon, right? Like when we breathe out CO2. So it's coming from biomass. Where is it going?
Would it go to the atmosphere? Or
Sorry?
the atmosphere?
Yeah, right? It's just going to be that cycle that we see. And so even though, right, it's not as simple as breathing in and out, you can think of the carbon cycle as, right, plants breathing in and then breathing out. And so it's this kind of back and forth. Okay. What about microbes? What are microbes working on and where are they putting their carbon? Microbes degrade living things, right, or recently dead things. And where are they putting that carbon? They allow plants to grow, right? They're the ones that break down all the dead stuff and then create that kind of fertilizer or compost. So in this case, we could imagine that from biomass to soil is going to be these three. And something you can bet, right, is that each of these dots are going to have an arrow before we're done, right? Nothing exists in a void, and we want to make sure that everything is connected as well. Let's skip number 4 for just a moment. Let's do 6. So when we talk about air-sea exchange, which two parts of this diagram are we referring to? Obviously the air and the sea, right, which just have different names here. So we might, for example, bring it down, and then I know these diagrams get messy. Bring it back up, so that's going to be, I guess you can call it, oh, that's not 5, right? That's 6. Sometimes I do 6 and 6 star, just to show that they're different. But the premise is that they are connected too. And now, did I miss one? So there is some sort of cycling that occurs in here. We don't really see it necessarily. Because something we'll find is that it doesn't really transfer the carbon very quickly. So we're not going to give this one a number, right? But we know that, for example, carbon can come in and then kind of change with the deep ocean and come out. It's just a lot slower, as we'll see in a second. So what's the one part of our diagram that doesn't have a dot? Or sorry, doesn't have an arrow?
4.
Fossilized carbon.
Yeah.
And what's the last one that we're going to need to bring that up into our picture?
Human items.
Yeah, right? So in this case, we can bring, technically we should bring it to the atmosphere. This is going to be number 4. And so I promise you, as you review for whatever next exam or whatnot, there's a much prettier way to draw this, as we'll see online. But all the ideas are here, right? You could imagine pretending that you were carbon in, right, soil, and then figuring out maybe where you go next over time. The other thing I just want to point out before we're done today is that there is a relatively fast portion of this diagram and a relatively slow portion. Right? And so when I say fast or slow, I don't mean like in a day or a month, right? But for example, everything that's going on in the atmosphere is going to be part of our fast carbon cycle, which is to say, right, that every year it's changing many, many, many tons and tons. And then we're also going to look at here on the bottom is what we call more of our slow carbon cycle, right? There's still carbon in our rocks, but it's going to take millennia, right, and ages to transform. And so really the worry is, right, is that if we take things from our slow carbon cycle and put them into our fast carbon cycle, right, it's going to go really quick. And so one of our solutions, right, is to take carbon from the atmosphere and shove it into the earth, right, put it into the fracking wells, turn it into concrete. They have all these ideas. And that would, in theory, slow the cycle down just a little bit. And so we'll pause here for today, but I am going to add some numbers to this next time. So we're going to start to talk about whether or not things are balanced. So thank you for your attention today. I'll be putting up a homework shortly, and have a good week. Be safe and vote if you can. Thank you, Internet.